I'll find it
Well,
somewhere.
good morning. Good morning. Shabbat Shalom. I'm welcome to Valley Beth Shalom Torah study. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein, joined this morning by my dear friend Rabbi Mark Gelman. It is Shabbos morning. It is Pesach morning, and it is a delight to be together. Now, the Torah we're going to read this morning is actually preempts the normal Torah reading for this time of year. And we read a special section, which is the end of the Pesach story. We began on the first day of Yom Tif. The seventh day is the end of the story. It's the story of Bishalach. It's the story of the crossing of the Red Sea. Perhaps the most cinematic moment, most dramatic moment in the entire Hebrew Bible. The people of Israel, having been slaves now for 4 generations, ran out of Egypt, ran so quickly they didn't have time for the bread to rise. They ran to the shore of the Red Sea, and they thought they could begin to experience freedom, when all of a sudden they hear Pharaoh's chariots coming from behind. And they look behind them and they see
Wait,
death coming from behind. There you go. And they look ahead of them and they see the open expanse of the sea. And at that moment, they wax eloquent and they fetch to Moshe, because as we know, it doesn't matter how imminent death might be, Jews will always find the capacity to fetch. And they said to Moses, was it because there weren't enough graves in Egypt? You brought us to die here in the wilderness. And the story is Moshe makes a beautifully heroic speech. He says, be quiet and watch the salvation of God. Now, there's something missing then. There's a lacuna in the text, because the next thing is God says to Moshe, why are you crying out to me? Tell them to move forward. So apparently what happens is at that moment, Moses turns around and says to God, what do I do? And God says, don't pray, don't ask, move. And he says, hold your arm over the sea. And he holds his arm over the sea, and the sea splits, and the people of Israel walk between the walls of the water. And then we get to the other side, and he holds his arm over the sea again, and Pharaoh's chariots are drowned. And then the people of Israel, for the very first time, breathe a sigh of freedom, and they begin to sing a song of faith. Michamocha ba'ilim Adonai. This moment is so important to the people of Israel that it's recreated not just on Pesach, but every single day in our prayers, morning and evening. We sing Michamocha ba'ilim Adonai. We tell this story, we recreate this moment, we re-experience that first amazing breath of freedom. Now, what's interesting here are two things. First thing, when the rabbis of the Midrash got hold of this, they decided to make one small tikkun, one small correction, not a small correction at all. They actually added a vignette. They added an entire character. They took his name from elsewhere in the Bible, but they added it to this story, because in the rabbi's retelling of the story, which is a very, very popular midrash, Moses holds his arm over the sea and nothing happens. And he does it again and nothing happens. And he's beginning to schwitz and he's reading the instructions on the stick and, hold stick over sea. Nothing happens. And he doesn't understand why the miracle won't come. Meanwhile, death is coming from behind. And the story that the rabbis tell is that nobody knew what was going on except one man. And they name him. His name is Nachshon ben Aminadav. He is the prince of the tribe of Judah. And it will become important later on because he's also going to be the ancestor of Boaz, who was the husband of Ruth, and the ancestor of King David, and the ancestor of the Messiah. Nachshon ben Aminadav understands what even Moses couldn't understand, that God was waiting for someone to step forward and take responsibility. So the story is that he pushes his way to the front and he jumps in the water. And his family looks at him with astonishment and begs him to come back, and he waves them off and goes farther till the water covers him up to his chest. And his people beg him not to be a fool and drown, and he waves them off and he goes up to the water, covers his neck, and now everyone watches in silence, and Nachshon takes one more step. Gelman, this is a midrash you should have written
you're
because it's
right.
that good, that good. He takes one more step, and the midrash says that when the breath of life began to leave him and bubble from his nostrils, at that moment when he was willing to give his life for his people, that's the moment God makes the miracle. The sea splits, Nachshon survives, the people cross in safety. Now, what the rabbis did in that midrash is so interesting. Because the Bible tells us a story in which we were fundamentally passive. God does all the action. God is the actor in history, according to the story of the Exodus as told in the Bible. And even in the Haggadah, we recite those words, Lo al yedei malach, velo al yedei seraph. It wasn't an angel, or it wasn't a seraph. It wasn't any other kind of being, person in the world. It was God himself who brought us out of Egypt. But the rabbis tell the story differently. What the rabbis are saying is that it takes human responsibility, an act of human initiative, to trigger the miracle. That is, to begin the process of redemption. And that redemption doesn't come when you wait by the side, criticizing, yelling, shouting advice, begging, even praying. Redemption doesn't come. Redemption only comes when someone's willing to jump in the water. So, Mark, what does that story do to our telling of the Exodus, and what does it do from the lessons we draw from the Exodus story on this seventh day of Pesach?
It's such a great midrash, and you told it perfectly. And I think what it tells us is that the rabbis had figured out that there was a flaw in the Exodus story. And that flaw was that everything in the Exodus is done to us and for us. Nothing in the Exodus story was done by us, unless you count putting blood on the doorpost as something done by us, but that's not really that big a deal. That was just basically to get the angel of death to pass over our houses. But everything in the whole story is about us being led. God is the actor, we're the actee. And the rabbis, I think, understood this problem. And the problem is, this produces a passive faith. It produces passivity, moral indolence, a kind of moral quietism in which God is everything, God does everything, and we do nothing. You still hear this among certain people in all faiths, some evangelicals and others, give it to God, give everything to God, God will do this, God will do that. And so I think the rabbis saw that flaw, and they put the Nachshon story in to sort of help assuage the doubters and the critics and the cynics about the Exodus story. What actually they did is they recreated the beginning of the Exodus at its highest moment. The beginning of the Exodus, in my opinion, was when Moses kills the taskmaster. To me, that's the start of it, because he's initiating an action of identification with the Israelite people. Before that, he was a prince in the temple, in the palace, and then all of a sudden, he goes out, he sees their suffering, he sees the taskmaster beating an Israelite slave, and he kills him. He steps forward and kills him. So I think the Nachshon story was, of course, known by the rabbis, and they picked up the theme of it to try and transform Judaism into a religion that demanded human action and didn't wait for God to intervene in history. And that's, I think, the reason and the meaning and the power behind the Nachshon Midrash.
Except that it puts us in a completely different religious universe.
Yeah.
I mean, the religious universe of the story, as it's told in the Torah, is a religious universe where God produces these miracles, and our job is to watch and to glory in that, to revere that. But basically, fundamentally, we're spectators. I mean, we're standing on the edge of the sea, and the sea splits, and the only one who has a role in this is Moses, and his role is diminished by the Haggadah. It's even diminished in the Torah, I think, to an extent. And the rabbis introduced something which is a completely different. I mean, it's not in the Torah. I mean, it really is mamish reading between the lines. You're completely changing the religious universe, because you're saying there really is a role for human responsibility, human initiative, human moral courage and moral imagination and moral action in the world. In fact, the miracle doesn't come until you act. The miracle isn't going to come because you pray. The miracle isn't going to come because you need it. The miracle is only going to come when you go. And what's amazing about the story, what I love about sort of the detail of the story, is you jump in the water, you don't know what's going to happen. The water's deep and the bottom is muddy and the currents are strong, and you don't know if you're going to survive, and you don't know if the water is going to open. You don't know if the water is going to open. I mean, reminded of Martin Luther King's last speech, that remarkable speech in Memphis when he says to the crowd, "I have been to the mountaintop and I have seen the promised land." Also,
I may not get there with you, but I have seen it.
But the problem is, yes, you may not get there. You may not make it. It may not happen. So there is an element of contingency in moral action. And that faith can't cover up. There's a certain amount of doubt there. That's a very different religious universe than the universe that the Torah introduces us to.
I think that's right, but I think I've always believed that the Torah is written on many levels. And there is a level in the Torah of God learning about how to shepherd and tutor and lead and inspire this creation, this human creation, that unlike any other creation was given free will. And that's also a story throughout the Torah that negates human passivity. And that's also explains why God decides the only way this is going to work, namely people using their free will to come to me, the only way this is going to work is if I withdraw from history. And that's exactly what happens. And the prophets make that case that, first there's an end to prophecy in Ezra, and then later on, God does not enter history. And I think it began with the first people. As a Midrash writer, I'm always looking at the deeper meaning of the stories that I'm trying to drush. And that's the Garden of Eden story. So it's about, here's this tree in the middle of the garden, which is the key to free will. It's the gift of free will. And God puts it there because God knew everything that was going to happen, of our abuse of free will, of our desire to give it up and be led, which is really what slavery is all about, what the Exodus is about. And so God, instead of just giving us free will, which God could have done, God puts the tree in the garden to say, look, I don't know how to tell you this, but there's a gift in the middle of this garden. And if you eat from this fruit, you will be fully human, knowing good and evil, the knowledge of good and evil, not eternal life. That's the reason for the expulsion, because that's stupid. People can't live forever. But the other tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which they did eat from, once they eat from that, they have free will. They choose to know the difference between good and evil. That's the gift that God put in the garden and that we accepted through sinning, through choosing. So that's the incredible depth of this, that choosing free will is also choosing to reject the garden. We had everything. We had everything. And we chose to eat the fruit that would allow us to live in the world and make choices. And once we ate of that fruit, several consequences immediately happened. Number one, God doesn't know what we're going to do. The rabbis had tremendous trouble with this because their version of God, unlike Aristotle's version, did not include God not knowing something. They weren't philosophically tutored in that way. They didn't understand that God couldn't know something. But the truth is, as soon as we eat of the fruit, God doesn't know stuff. And it's in the story. God says, where are you? Ayeka, where are you, Adam? How could God not know? He's a naked guy hiding behind a bush, and God doesn't know where he is? No, obviously that's not the meaning of that. The meaning is, all right, Adam, you're now a human with free will, and I don't know what you're going to choose next. And the answer of what you will choose is in you. And that's why I need to know, where are you? Where are you in the choosing? And that's exactly God's attitude toward us, that God wants us to use our free will. And there's another element to the free will, which is not so dry and philosophical. It's that free will is the only way to love. The heart of love, the essence of love, is freedom. You choose to love the object of your love. There's no way to love God in a meaningful way unless you freely choose to love God. God can't command, you shall love the Lord your God. Yeah, fine. But it's up to you to actually do the loving. And so free will enables us to choose good over evil, and free will enables us to love. That's the biggest lesson of the Torah I have ever learned.
I want to come back to free will in a minute, but before we do, I want to go back to the previous idea about passivity and activity, because I think there's another lesson I don't want to escape from. This morning, the Torah reading will end at the end of the song, right? We're going to sing the song of the sea. And at the end of the song, that's where the Torah reading ends. But that's not where the Torah ends the story. And the Torah very cleverly, I think brilliantly, offers us two vignettes which follow the Red Sea story. But unfortunately, they're not part of today's Torah portion. The first one is 3 days later, 72 hours later, the people of Israel are fetching to Moses all over again. There's no water, right? And then the next thing is they fetch that there's no food. And Moses provides water, and God provides water, and God provides manna, provides food. Now, what's so interesting about this story, first of all, is that the faith that is built by the apocalyptic event of the crossing of the sea, the faith that is built, and it says it explicitly in the Torah, because the last line of the story is, V'yaminu b'Adonai b'Moshe avdo. They believed in God and they trusted Moses. And then 3 days, 72 hours later, they're back to fetching again. And once again, the fetches are gloriously articulate.
Garlic, that's my favorite. We have no garlic here.
They didn't have, the midnight buffet wasn't what it was back in Egypt. Yeah, but here's what's interesting. It's what you said a moment ago. If they are passive, simply recipients of God's miracles, if they are the passive recipients of redemption, the passive spectators of history, then this is exactly the kind of behavior that you would expect of them, because nothing's been asked of them in the whole process. So they sit back and say to the concierge, why isn't there fresh fruit in my room, right? You would have expected a people to say to Moses,
pretty good hotels.
Well,
in the ones I stay at, I'm just lucky if there's no roaches in there.
Right. Sorry. It's just I want to remember that what it was like in Egypt. I want to remember. Yeah. But you see, none of them walk up and say, can we go look for food? Not one of them volunteers to go look for food or look for water. Not one of them says, hey, we brought something from Egypt. Let's pool it. We'll all have enough food. No one suggests a solution. Everyone fetches about the problem, which is a classic scenario. Rabbis get used to this kind of thing. It's a classic scenario when a people is reduced to passivity and they're expecting favors and miracles to come their own way. And that's one of the great mistakes that the rabbis noticed. That's why they add the Nachshon story. You have to be a partner in the bringing of redemption, or else redemption isn't going to come, because you can't simply wait for it to come. And that's part of the character of the people that's missing. And it's one of the things I think you said wonderfully. It's what God needs to learn. It takes a long time for God to learn this, by the way, probably the 40 years of the wandering, because that's when you get a generation of people who are now willing to stand up and go fight for the land. Otherwise, they just want waiting for the concierge to bring the fresh fruit to their room.
So let me ask you, Eddie, let me ask you, how long does it take for us to win?
That's a great question.
How
Because
long?
all of us would like to wait, and all of us would like to wait, right? All of us would like to have somebody else do it for us. All of us would like to have somebody else do it for us.
You know, I'll tell you where I feel most embarrassed, but I can't change that impulse within me as well. You know where it is? It's putting the kvitlach in the kotel, putting the little notes into the wall. I've actually left a few at the Rebbe's grave as well, because I visited there in New York regularly. And I put the thing in, and there was a time I thought I needed something desperately, and I put a note in, and it came to pass, but I was ashamed at putting the note in, because it was a passive faith. It's, God, I need you to do this for me. I need you to do
Well,
this.
but you're permitted to do that if you reach the end of your means. If you've really exhausted all the other means that you have in the world, and then you say, I've done everything I can do, God, now it's in your hands. That, I think, is a legitimate expression.
I'm not sure, Eddie. I think that's exactly when your free will matters most.
Well, it could, but I love to see you exhaust all the means. I mean, my experience is this: I've been at the wall, and I don't put kvittel, but I've seen people put kvitlach. And then a dear friend of mine got very sick in Jerusalem, and we went to go see him at the hospital, at Hadassah Hospital. And I saw the other form of prayer. The Zionist critique of traditional religion was, you've been spectators too long, it's time to bring redemption ourselves. That's been the Zionist critique. So across town from the Kotel is Hadassah Hospital. And I'm watching my friend who's very ill, and I'm worried about him deeply. And I'm watching a team of doctors and nurses. And there's a French doctor, a Russian doctor, an Arab doctor, and 3 Israeli nurses. And I don't know what language they talk to each other in. It's a little bit of English and a little bit of Hebrew, but they're working together to save my friend. And I'm marveling at what a miracle it is that this state of Israel brings together people of such different backgrounds in service of life and in opposition to death. And that's the other side of it. That's the other miracle. That's the miracle that we've created instead of a miracle that we waited to happen. So that brings me to my other question, my dear teacher and friend. So this coming week, we're going to begin the celebration of 2 holidays. And we'll speak about this a bit more next week as well. On Wednesday night, we're going to commemorate what the whole Jewish world commemorates as Yom HaShoah, a commemoration of the Shoah. Now, of course, the Shoah is an event that takes place over many, many, many years. It was chosen because this was the day of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which happened just around Pesach time. But this is when we remember the 6 million. This is when we remember the atrocities, the horrors of the Shoah. And then just a week later, we're going to have Yom HaZikaron and then Yom HaAtzmaut. We're going to celebrate the advent of the creation of the state of Israel. Now, I would suggest to you that these two events, the Shoah and the Advent of the State of Israel, rival the two greatest events in all of Jewish history. That if the greatest moment of redemption in all of Jewish history is Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, the recreation of the state of Israel certainly rivals it. And if the greatest moment of destruction in all of Jewish history was the destruction of the temple in 70, the Shoah certainly rivals or is bigger than it, outmatches it. And the question is, how do you live with this oscillation between these three religious moments? The religious moment of a Passover story, which culminates in the crossing of the Red Sea, a God who reaches into the world and saves us. And then this moment of tragedy, which is beyond imagination and beyond telling. And then this moment of redemption, which we still haven't quite figured out exactly what it means to us and how significant it is. And how do you organize these three ideas and at the same time believe in a God? And the fundamental question that is raised before us, before rabbis and all sensitive Jews, is on Pesach you told us of a God of history, a God who protects his people, a God who is concerned for his people, a God who reaches into history because he has a stake in the life of this people. And where is that God in the Shoah? Where is that God in Auschwitz? Where's that God when 1 million Jewish children were destroyed? So Mark, how do you answer that question when Jews raise it for us?
Well, before I address the theological element, there's an element I wanted to make sure we don't lose, and that is, if it's true that these two events outdo even the Exodus, and I will take issue with it for this reason. One of the ways that we remember the Exodus is by this transcendently brilliant ritual of the Passover Seder. There isn't a single ritual that has been created since the Holocaust to commemorate the Holocaust. Not one. And there is not a single ritual since the founding of the State of Israel that celebrates the founding of the State of Israel with the kind of spiritual eloquence that we see in the Haggadah. So one of the reasons that I doubt the statement, I'm uncomfortable with the statement, though I understand completely the motivation behind it, that these are the greatest events, even greater than the old ones, is that they have no rituals to commemorate. Now, as to the theological point, I have, as you might imagine, a contrarian view of the Holocaust. I do not believe there are any theological issues in the Holocaust, except one: why have we not learned to use our free will? It has nothing to do with God, nothing. The idea of where was God in the Holocaust is answered in a simple question. Where were you when Hitler was coming to power in 31, 32, 33? Why didn't you stop fascism when you could have stopped it before what Arthur Cohn calls the tremendum? Where were you? Why didn't you stop it? Why didn't you stop fascism? What are you talking to me about? Why did you say, oh, it's okay, as developed countries in the West? You said, well, it's all right. Let's let Hitler and Stalin bleed each other to death. We hate Hitler and we hate Stalin, and maybe they'll just both die by bleeding each other, which didn't work. And why don't we just wait and let them bomb England into the Stone Age? That didn't work. So the Holocaust is about, again, human indolence, human passivity. It's not like we were waiting for anyone. It's that we didn't care. to my recollection, there was only one demonstration against the Holocaust by American Jews. And that was mainly organized by Orthodox rabbis. And there was a gathering at Madison Square Garden, one. But basically, there was nothing. And, all the books of the silence of American Jewry during the Holocaust affirm that. So the question is about the Holocaust, why didn't we act? And if you want to say, well, the Holocaust is such a huge thing, why didn't God act? Why didn't God act in Rwanda? Why didn't God act in Kosovo and in Bosnia? Why didn't God act in the Armenian genocide? What before the war? What? There's lots of genocides that have occurred since the Holocaust. And have we acted to stop them? I remember trying to get a bunch of rabbis to go to Washington. I went with a few to try and get them to arm the Bosnian Muslims so they could defend themselves against the Croatian genocide. And I couldn't get anyone. So I never bought. My teacher gave up his faith. He was the most brilliant rabbi I'd ever met, Richard Rubinstein. And he gave up his entire faith because he couldn't answer the question, where was God in the Holocaust? And I know it's silly to say, it's arrogant to say such a thing, but why is this about God? Because you believe God should intervene and stop all evil in the world? Is that the deal you think God cut with us? That God agrees to stop all evil in the world while we do nothing? That's not the deal. God never promises such a thing. It's arrogant to say such a thing. I love comic books, and my favorite, since I'm an old guy, is Superman. And it's what I call the Superman problem. If you have Superman, what do you need to do anything for it? Just call Soup. Call Soup. And he'll just fix everything by using his X-ray vision or whatever, and he'll fix it for you. Well, that just isn't the way things work. And it isn't the way God promised things would work. And if it did work that way, there would only be one way for it to work. And that would be for God to annul and suspend our free will, which leads me to the statement that a world with Auschwitz in it, paradoxically, tragically, is better than a world without Auschwitz, for only one reason. A world without Auschwitz could only occur if we don't have free will. And if we have free will, the burden of the Holocaust is on us. Now, as far as the state of Israel, was God in history to give us the state of Israel? I think that's also arrogant to say. Look, we had a united monarchy, Saul, David, and Solomon, for 300 years, from 1,000 to 700, basically. And we had it for only one reason. The three empires of the ancient Near East were all weak at that time for 300 years. Egypt, Assyria, and Babylonia. Then they got strong, first Assyria, and then they conquered the north in 722. And then Babylonia, and they conquered the south in 586 before the Common Era. So Israel occurred at a certain time when the British mandate was weak, when the Arab League was weak, when there was massive guilt in the West for allowing the Holocaust, whose implications in 48 were clear. So there was a bunch of reasons why the state of Israel was created. And most of all, the courage, the heroism of the kibbutzniks of the first Aliyah, of Begin and Ben Gurion, and of their courage in claiming the land. So I'm not buying that the Holocaust and the state of Israel are equal to the ancient ones, to the ancient events. What I am buying is that God has learned. God learned how to deal with free will, and we haven't. We still have the slave mentality that we want to be taken care of. We want food brought to us without us having to till the land. The curses in the Garden of Eden are all not curses at all, and we never call them original sins. And Adam has to till the soil and sweat and bring forth food. That's the way it's supposed to be. The garden is unnatural, that you just reach to a tree and everything is there? No. So I believe God learned, and we haven't yet. But there's always hope.
But that's the question, Mark. Why is there hope? I mean,
Well,
if this really is the, if this really is this, if there really is the scenario that you're pointing, that's my problem with what you said. I mean, I really appreciate the way that you structured it. It was very, very clear. First of all, I do believe that these two events match the ancient events. The reason why we haven't come up with rituals for them is precisely because they're so recent, because we haven't yet figured out the story we wish to learn from them, the story that we want to tell. The rabbis created the Pesach Seder 1,500 years after the Exodus. You know, it takes a while. Jews are slow that way. It takes a while to be able to figure out what this moment means for us, what we learn from this moment, how it comes to shape our vision of the world. And we haven't yet figured out, partly because there are survivors walking among us, thank God, and they should live and be well. But as long as there are survivors walking among us who are able to tell their own stories, it's very difficult for us to construct our own narratives of what this means for us. So I'm suggesting that we will come up with rituals soon. It'll take another generation or so, and there will be a ritual for Yom HaShoah, and there will be a ritual for Yom HaAtzmaut. Yom HaAtzmaut.
You're the best I know. So let me press you on this, and let me ask you to just speculate. What will the ritual for Yom HaShoah look like?
The question is a wonderful question, but there's a deeper question that it rests upon, which is, tell me what happened. See, I can tell you that 6 million Jews were murdered, that 11 million human beings were murdered. I can tell you that it took place in places called Auschwitz and Treblinka and Belsen. The question is, who did it and why? And what do we learn from it? That's really the question. You know, there are those who would like to say that a great European nation was hijacked by a madman, and this was an aberration of Western history. And there are others who would like to say this is the ultimate expression of Christian Europe's hatred for the Jews, and that this is what deep in the heart of Christian Europe. And there are others who will say, you know, there was an Israeli song that said, Kol ha'olam negdenu. This is the world's perennial hatred of the Jew. We have to decide what story we're going to tell. I've said this many times. I think it's so significant that the Seder plate only has one portion of maror, and you don't eat it without the sweetness of charoset. The rabbis took the Seder story and turned it from a commemoration of the bitterness of slavery into a celebration of the sweetness of liberation. Matzah, which is halach ma'anya at the beginning of the Seder, the poor dry bread of slaves, becomes the food of liberation by the end of the Seder. Charoset, which is mortar at the beginning, becomes sweetness at the end. So the question we have to ask ourselves, Mark, is what do we need to learn? What do we choose to learn? What story are we going to construct for our children's children? And that question has to be debated now quite openly. And we can do it now that the survivors have mostly left the scene and given us permission to tell their stories. And I think that's a very important. Wait, hang on. Because here's the question. It's a question that my teacher asked. So your teacher was Rubenstein, and my teacher was Schulweis, who ironically was Rubenstein's classmate at JTS.
Yes,
And Schulweis read Rubinstein and was touched by him very deeply, but rejected Rubinstein's basic atheism because he said, and this is why I ask you the question, I ask it in earnestness, if that's what you believe, there's no hope. And we have to give people hope. That's what religion is for. That's what Torah is about. And that's what the Seder teaches us. So how do you construct a story of the Shoah that doesn't rob my children of all hope for the redemption of the world and rob them of their own sense of responsibility for healing and helping and fixing the world? That was Schulweis's problem. And he also came up with a radical theology about this. He turned God into a verb, and said, I believe in godliness instead of God, which many people find really moving and other people find really wanting. But I respect so much the desire to say, I refuse to allow the Shoah narrative to steal all the hope out of the next generation of Jews. And I think that's part of the conversation that we have to have as we answer this question. I really respect what you talk about. It's free will and human beings making choices. And Superman, the Superman analogy is remarkable. It's meaningful. The question, though, is, okay, so now let's tell the story. Let's figure out how to tell the story. And that really is the question that occurs to me on this day, which is so interesting because it's the reason I chose this day to ask this question is because the contrast between our telling the story of the splitting of the sea and our telling of the story of Shoah comes a few days apart. And the tension between the two events just strikes me as so poignant and so painful. Go ahead, please.
No, I love that, and I respect that, and I think you have had, as always, an instinct for the jugular. Those are the important questions. But here's the response to that question. If the reason there's no rituals for the Holocaust is that we haven't decided whether we're going to tell the story of Kol ha'olam negdenu, the whole world is always against us, or whether we're going to tell the story of the Holocaust that there were these Schindler-like actions by Nachshon-like actions by people who refused to submit to the evil that was all around them. I'd say if we come to the conclusion that the world is fundamentally anti-Semitic and will always hate us, there is no hope. There is no hope from that. And I think for many Jews, that's a conclusion they have come to. In all the work that I did with Tom Hartman, the most difficult pushback that I received, and we were famously praised, excessively, I think, praised for what we were doing. But the blowback that did occur was, you are working with a priest, and that church turned its back on Jews, and that church said, may his blood be on us and our children. How can you work with what they would call goyim? How can you work with them when they hate us? And they've always hated us, and they will always hate us. And let me just give a personal story to this. One of the things Tommy and I did is we organized with a dear friend of ours who's a businessman and a brilliant engineer and who created the digital X-ray machine. We donated mammography units to Eastern Europe in a project that we created. And one day we were in Krakow, Poland, and we were reviewing the installation of a mammography unit that had just been put there. And we were giving these away. And they were the most sophisticated mammography units in Europe at the time. So a doctor was saying, there's a man and his wife, they want to meet you because there's a plaque that says this was donated by a rabbi and a priest and a businessman. And the guy comes out and he looks like he's central casting Polish peasant. And his wife's the same thing. They were actually round. They were roundish people. And they came out of this x-ray room and he's crying and she's crying. I said, so you all right? Pray for you. And he said, no, it's okay. They just diagnosed my wife as having a stage 3 or 4, stage 1 breast cancer, which no machine in Poland could pick up except your machine. And because they picked it up, her life is going to be saved. And my question to you is this: why would you do this for us? I was taught to hate Jews by my parents, and they were taught by their parents. Why would you give us something like this to heal my wife, knowing what we, our people, did to your people in the war? And for the very longest time, I was speechless, which is pretty much enough to say about it.
That's a miracle, yeah.
That's a miracle right there. And finally, I don't know where this came from. In my heart, it was very in the deep place of my heart. I said to him, we did this because we only have 2 choices. We can continue to hate each other, or we can find each other. And it seems to me that today is a very good day to find each other. And we embrace. And that, Eddie, my dear friend, my beloved friend and teacher, that is what I believe. And that is the source of my hope.
And I think that's a beautiful way to finish this conversation, because what we're saying is something very profound. That this theology that we are reaching for, an idea that we are reaching for, a set of beliefs that we're reaching for, a way of understanding the world that we're reaching for, a way of telling the story of the Holocaust that we're reaching for, has to be not just historically true, that's for sure, and authentic, but it also has to yield it has to yield a moral. It has to yield a moral sensibility. And you've talked about a moral sensibility of human solidarity, of human action, and of hope. That's what it has to come to. And that's why I think it's a brilliant way to put it. So that becomes one of the measures of this theology, that a theology that denies us that hope, a theology that says the world is a dark, horrible place and people aren't worth sacrificing for, isn't what we are going to put in front of our children. That's not what we're going to do. We're going to find a different way. We're going to find a different way to tell the story. I mean, I can give the other story that I would share with you, which is a similar stories. In his later years, Harold Schulweis decided that the only real response to the Holocaust was to fight genocide everywhere. And the first place he went to fight it was in Darfur. And he organized Jewish World Watch and started fighting for Darfur. And Darfur is a place on the other side of the planet, the most godforsaken place there could possibly be. And he started doing all of these projects. And wherever he would go and speak about this, people would say, "You're Jewish. What are you doing this for? What are they to us?" And he would say, that's exactly the opposite response. That's what they said when we suffered. Right. But the most telling account was an account that sounded so much like yours, Mark. He met with the community of Sudanese refugees here in Los Angeles. And one of the leaders of that community asked him, "Rabbi, how many Jews are in Darfur?" And he said, "None to my knowledge." And the guy said, "Well, then why are you doing this?" And he said, "Because that's what we need to do for each other. That's the choice now that we have been taught to make. So the theology that we choose to embrace this week as we come out of Pesach and sit to remember the Holocaust and look forward to Yom Ha'atzmaut is a theology of hope and a theology of action. I think it's a beautiful way to put it. Thank you. So let me wish you a good Shabbos and a good Pesach, a good finish to your Pesach. And to everyone listening, a good Shabbos and a good finish to your Pesach. Sunday night, we finish the holiday here in LA. It's about 8:15 or so. I expect there'll be long lines
Saturday
at all
night
of them.
for Reform Jews and for Israeli Jews.
Yeah, and I imagine there'll be long lines at all the pizzerias. So please take very good care. We hope to see each other during the course of this week. Take good care and Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, Eddie. I love you.